It's 2 a.m. on the East Coast. The world has gone quiet, but if you're listening to this, you aren't asleep. Welcome to the night shift. Tonight, we are opening the dispatch files on something we all crave: the illusion of safety. We buy houses in quiet suburbs. We install heavy deadbolts. And we put cameras on our doorbells because we believe they will keep the outside world outside. But what happens when the technology you bought to watch the perimeter ends up showing you a threat that is already inside? Here are 3 deeply disturbing stories about the places we are supposed to feel the safest. Lock your doors, turn down the lights, and let's begin with a cookie-cutter subdivision in Texas. I live in a cookie-cutter subdivision in Plano, Texas. It's the kind of sprawling, manufactured neighborhood where every house is painted in varying, unremarkable shades of beige or slate gray. It's the kind of place where the homeowners association measures your grass with a ruler, and the concept of community is strictly limited to a passive-aggressive Facebook group about misplaced recycling bins. I work from home as a data analyst. I live alone, order my groceries via an app, and I haven't spoken a single word to my neighbors in the 2 years I've lived here. My life is an exercise in extreme, isolated routine. I like it that way. The predictability is comforting. I have a Ring doorbell camera. In this neighborhood, everyone does. You look down the street at night, and every porch has that same glowing blue halo. It's the modern illusion of safety. 3 months ago, the illusion shattered. The camera started sending me motion alerts in the dead of night, exactly at 3:14 a.m. The first time it happened, I jolted awake, my heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, the sudden glare of the screen burning my eyes, and opened the app. The live feed loaded, showing my front porch bathed in the eerie, washed-out green and gray infrared glow of the camera's night vision. Standing dead center on my welcome mat was a figure. They were wearing a heavy, oversized, faded gray hoodie. In the Texas heat, even at night, it was a bizarre choice of clothing. The hood was pulled up high and cinched tight, completely obscuring their face in a deep pool of black shadow. Their hands were shoved deep into the front pockets. They weren't trying the door handle. They weren't looking around for delivered packages. They were just standing there, facing the heavy wooden door, perfectly, unnervingly still. It didn't look like a person waiting for someone to answer. It looked like a mannequin. I watched the time code on the video tick by. They stood there for exactly 1 minute, 60 seconds of total immobility. Then, they simply turned on their heel, walked down the concrete driveway, and disappeared out of the camera's narrow frame. I called the non-emergency police line. An officer did a drive-by about 30 minutes later. He shined a heavy spotlight across my lawn, knocked on my door, and told me it was probably just a drunk teenager who got the wrong address. He told me to keep my doors locked and have a good night. But it didn't stop. Every single night, 3:14 a.m., the motion alert. I would lay in bed, completely paralyzed by a cold, creeping dread, watching the live feed of the gray hoodie standing on my porch for 60 seconds before leaving. By the second week, the gifts started appearing. I would open my front door at 8 a.m. to fetch my coffee delivery, and find items placed meticulously on the exact center of the welcome mat. The first day, it was a heavily rusted paring knife, the blade chipped and dull. I threw it in the trash, telling myself it was a sick prank. The third day, it was a dead blue jay. Its wings had been violently stretched out and pinned back with silver sewing needles. The seventh day is when my sanity finally cracked. I opened the door to find a Polaroid photograph sitting face up on the mat. I picked it up with a trembling hand, the humid morning air suddenly feeling like it was suffocating me. It was a picture of me, I was fast asleep in my own bed, tangled in the sheets. The angle and the flash indicated it had been taken from the deep corner of my bedroom, right next to the sliding door of my closet. I completely lost it. The idea that someone had stood in the dark of my bedroom, watched me sleep, and taken a photo without making a sound. It made me physically ill. I drove straight to a sporting goods store and bought a Glock 19. I paid an emergency locksmith double his hourly rate to install heavy-duty, reinforced deadbolts on every exterior door of the house. I took a hammer and nailed the first-floor windows permanently shut. But the Ring camera was still useless. It only ever caught the person standing on the porch. Because of its narrow field of view and the 5-second recording delay, it never caught them approaching the house, and it certainly never caught them breaking in. I needed to see the broader picture. I needed to see where this freak was coming from. I went to Bass Pro Shops and bought a high-definition, motion-activated trail camera, the kind hunters use to track deer in the pitch black. I strapped it high up on the trunk of the massive oak tree in my front yard, angling it down to cover the entire driveway, the street, the porch, and the front door. There were no blind spots. That night, I refused to sleep. I couldn't. I sat on my living room couch in the pitch dark. The central AC hummed in the background. The Glock rested heavy and cold on my lap. I was nursing my 4th energy drink, my eyes burning from exhaustion, staring at the glowing red numbers of the digital clock on the cable box. 3:14 a.m. My phone vibrated violently against the glass of the coffee table. Motion detected at your front door. I didn't move. I didn't get up to check the peephole. The fear was a tangible physical weight pressing me deep into the couch cushions. I gripped the handle of the gun, my palms slick with cold sweat, aiming it at the hallway leading to the front door. I sat there in total, agonizing silence until the sun finally began to bleed through the plastic blinds. At 6:30 a.m., as soon as it was fully light, I unlocked the deadbolts on the front door, sprinted barefoot to the oak tree, unstrapped the trail camera, and rushed back inside, locking everything behind me. I plugged the SD card into my laptop. My hands were shaking so badly, I dropped the small piece of plastic twice. I opened the video file, timestamped at 3:13 a.m. I expected to see a car pulling up to the curb. I expected to see a stalker creeping out from the thick bushes on the side of my house. That is not what the video showed. The video began. The front of my house looked eerie and desolate in the crisp, green night vision. For 10 agonizing seconds, nothing happened. Then, the heavy wooden front door, the door I had personally deadbolted from the inside just hours earlier, slowly swung open. A figure stepped out of my house. They were wearing the oversized gray hoodie. They walked onto the porch, closed the door quietly behind them, and turned around to face the house. They stood there, perfectly still, for exactly 1 minute, triggering the Ring camera alert. Then, the figure reached up with both hands, grabbed the thick fabric of the hood, and slowly pulled it back. The breath hitched in my throat. The blood rushed out of my head, leaving a cold, buzzing numbness in my ears. The room started to spin. It was me. I was staring at my own face on the glowing laptop. My eyes were open, but they looked dead, vacant. I watched myself reach into the deep pocket of the hoodie, pull out a small, unidentifiable object, and place it gently on the welcome mat. Then, I watched myself pull a key from my pocket, unlock the door, step back inside the house, and pull the door shut, locking the deadbolt behind me. I went to a neurologist 3 days ago. He was a very calm, older man. He listened to my story, looked at the dark circles under my eyes, and used phrases like ambient-induced fugue states, severe sleepwalking, and dissociative identity disorder. He suggested that the extreme, unbroken isolation of working from home for 2 years had fractured my psyche. My brain, starved for interaction and stimulation, had essentially manufactured a threat, causing me to act out a bizarre, self-terrorizing routine in my sleep. He prescribed a heavy dose of antipsychotics and strongly suggested I leave the house and stay with family in another state. My parents agree with him. I showed them the video, and they look at me with a mixture of deep pity and genuine fear. They think I am losing my mind. They think I am a danger to myself. And honestly, maybe I am. The logic is incredibly sound. It is the only rational, medical explanation that doesn't involve the supernatural or the impossible. Except for one detail. The detail that proves the doctor is wrong. The detail that proves I am not safe in this house. When my phone buzzed with the ring alert at 3:14 a.m. that night, I was awake. I was sitting on the couch in the living room. I was holding a loaded gun. I was staring at the hallway. I never stood up. I never put on a gray hoodie. I never walked to the front door. So, if I was sitting on the couch, wide awake, terrified out of my mind, who the hell did the trail camera record walking out of my bedroom? When the email containing this story hit my dispatch inbox, I spent a long time looking at that final detail. The neurologist gave a neat clinical diagnosis: a fractured mind. It's comforting to blame the brain. But as an analyst, I look at the physical evidence. The evidence the doctor ignored. Did you notice the progression of the gifts? A rusted knife. A blue jay meticulously pinned with sewing needles. A vintage Polaroid photograph. If this man was simply sleepwalking in a modern, sterile suburban home, where did he get a dead bird, silver needles, and an old-school Polaroid camera at 3 in the morning? But here is the most terrifying detail that you might have missed. Watch that trail camera footage in your mind again. The figure steps out, places the item, and then uses a key to lock the deadbolt from the outside. But remember the narrator's own words just hours prior? He explicitly stated he was sitting on his couch, staring at a front door that he had permanently deadbolted from the inside. If the door was locked from the inside, how did the figure open it to step out? Unless the thing sitting on the couch holding the gun wasn't the original homeowner anymore. What if the psychological shift wasn't a hallucination, but a replacement? What if the real human was already locked out in the cold, and the entity on the couch was just trying to remember how to live a normal life? What do you think? Drop your theories in the comments below. I'll pin the one that breaks this case wide open. If that first story made you want to double-check your security cameras, this next one will make you want to check your floorboards. Our second story tonight takes us to the forgotten edges of Akron, Ohio. They say that extreme stress and sleep deprivation can make a person hallucinate. It can make the brain short-circuit and play terrifying tricks on you in the dark. But what happens when the nightmare ends? The sun comes up, and the physical evidence left behind proves that your mind wasn't playing tricks on you at all? Listen very closely to this one, and ask yourself what you would have done. I live in a manufactured home on the ragged edge of Akron, Ohio. It's the kind of neglected subdivision that city planners try to forget. The yards are mostly dead dirt and crabgrass. The chain-link fences sag under the weight of overgrown ivy, and nobody makes eye contact when they take out the trash. It's a place for people who are just trying to get by, or trying to hide. It was the second week of August last year, and the Midwest was trapped under a heat wave that felt malicious. The air was thick, wet, and tasted like warm exhaust. My window AC unit had rattled its last breath 3 days prior, leaving me to rely on a cheap box fan that just pushed the hot, stale air around the narrow hallway. I wasn't sleeping. I was running on black coffee, cheap nicotine, and the grinding, hollow anxiety of a bitter custody dispute. My ex-wife had taken our 6-year-old daughter, Lily, to her mother's place down in Tampa, Florida. The house was far too quiet without her. The silence was heavy. That's when the scratching started. It began on a Tuesday night. I was sitting at the sticky kitchen table in my boxers, staring blankly at a stack of final notice legal bills, when I heard it scrape. pause, scrape. It was coming from directly beneath the peeling yellow linoleum, right under my bare feet. I ignored it at first. The wooden skirting around the crawl space of my house was rotted out in the back. Raccoons, possums, feral cats. They were always looking for shade during the summer. I stomped my heel hard against the floorboards. The sound stopped instantly. I took a drag of my cigarette and went back to my bills. But by Thursday, the scratching had changed. It wasn't localized to the kitchen anymore. It followed me when I sat on the broken sofa in the living room to watch the late-night news. The scratching moved directly under the floorboards beneath the coffee table. When I finally lay in bed, sweating through the thin sheets, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, the scraping settled right beneath my mattress. It was rhythmic, deliberate, and it no longer sounded like animal claws. It sounded exactly like human fingernails dragging against cheap plywood. By Saturday, my sleep deprivation had morphed into a dangerous, low-grade delirium. Every shadow looked wrong. Every floorboard creak made me jump. I was pacing the narrow hallway at 2 a.m., holding a heavy maglite flashlight like a club. The house was dead silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator. Then, I heard the whisper. It drifted up through the metal floor vent near the bathroom. It was faint, distorted by the fiberglass insulation and dry dirt, but the cadence was unmistakable. "Daddy?" I froze. The blood drained from my face so fast, I had to lean against the drywall to keep from falling over. "It's so dark down here. I don't like the dirt." It was Lily's voice, my 6-year-old daughter, who was supposed to be 1,000 miles away in Florida. The voice didn't sound like a recording. It didn't sound like an echo. It sounded breathless, terrified, and choked with dust. "Please let me out, Papa Bear. It hurts." My heart slammed against my ribs. Papa Bear, that was her secret name for me. Not her mother, not her teachers. Nobody else in the entire world knew that name. Logic vanished. The custody battle, the distance, the absolute physical impossibility of her being under my house in Ohio. None of it mattered. The primal, chemical instinct of a father completely overrode my frontal lobe. I marched into my bedroom, grabbed the Remington 12-gauge from my closet, racked a shell into the chamber, and bolted out the back door into the suffocating humidity. I dropped to my knees in the overgrown weeds behind the house, shoving the broken, splintered plywood skirting aside. The smell of the crawl space hit me instantly. A foul, gag-inducing mixture of dry rot, copper, and something sweet and sickening, like old meat left in the sun. I clicked on the maglite and swept the blinding beam into the absolute darkness. The beam cut through the thick dust motes floating in the stagnant air. About 20 feet back, huddled tightly between the concrete cinder block pylons, was a shape. It was pale, bone white. It was crouched on all fours, roughly the size of a child. But the anatomy was completely wrong. The arms were far too long, the elbows jutting upward at a severe backward angle, like the legs of a grasshopper. It was wearing a filthy, oversized yellow t-shirt. "Papa Bear," the voice echoed from the shape, vibrating in the humid air. But as the beam steadied on its face, my mind broke. The face was a smooth, pale expanse of skin. It had no nose. It had no lips. Just two massive, reflective black eyes that caught the flashlight beam, and a horizontal slit in the skin that tore open when it spoke, revealing a cavern of flat, uniform teeth. It didn't retreat from the light. It lunged forward, scrambling over the dirt with an erratic, scuttling speed that defied gravity. I didn't think. I pulled the trigger. The roar of the shotgun in that enclosed space ruptured my left eardrum. The sheer recoil threw me backward into the mud. I pumped the action, firing blindly into the dark crawl space until the magazine was completely empty. The ringing in my ears was absolute. I scrambled backward through the wet weeds, gasping for air, grabbed my cell phone from the porch, and dialed 911. I sat on the back steps, chain smoking, waiting for the red and blue lights to cut through the neighborhood. I told the dispatcher there was a monster under my house. When the police arrived, they drew their weapons, shined their tactical lights, and went under the skirting. 10 minutes later, they didn't drag out a pale, faceless entity with backward joints. The paramedics brought out a heavy, black body bag. Inside the bag was Toby Reynolds. Toby was a 16-year-old boy who lived in a trailer 3 streets down. He was severely autistic and completely nonverbal. His mother had reported him missing to the local precinct hours earlier. According to her, when Toby got overwhelmed by heavy thunderstorms or extreme summer heat, he had a habit of wandering off and squeezing into tight, dark spaces to self-soothe. He had been wearing a yellow t-shirt. The official police report concluded that I was suffering from severe sleep deprivation, aggravated by caffeine and extreme emotional stress. I had fired blindly into a dark space, killing an unarmed, mentally disabled teenager who had simply crawled under my house to find a cool place to sleep. The community crucified me. The local news painted me as a trigger-happy lunatic. My ex-wife used the police report to secure full, permanent, supervised-only custody of Lily. The county prosecutor tried to nail me for involuntary manslaughter, but my attorney was ruthless. He successfully argued the castle doctrine. Because Toby had physically breached the foundation of my property at 2 a.m., and because my compromised mental state led me to reasonably believe my life was in danger in the dark, the jury acquitted me. I am legally a free man. I packed up what little I had left and moved across the country to a 3rd-floor apartment in Henderson, Nevada, desperately trying to outrun the ghost of my mistake. I tell myself every single day that the heat, the nicotine, and the insomnia made me hallucinate the monster. I tell myself my guilty conscience manufactured my daughter's voice out of the sound of a scared teenager shifting in the dirt. I accepted the psychological explanation. It's the only way I can look in the mirror. But there is one detail I have never told the police. I never told my expensive lawyer, and I certainly haven't told my therapist. It is the reason I sleep with every single light on in my apartment, and the reason I still keep that Remington shotgun loaded under my bed. Toby Reynolds was profoundly nonverbal. According to his mother's sworn testimony, he had not spoken a single, coherent word since he was 3 years old. He didn't know me, he didn't know my house, and he certainly didn't know my daughter. So, how did he know to call me Papa Bear? And more importantly, if Toby is dead, and the doctors say it was all in my head, why did I wake up this morning to find a fresh set of small, muddy handprints pressed onto the inside of my 3rd-floor bedroom window? When I was reviewing the files for this dispatch, the police report almost made perfect sense. Micro-sleep psychosis. It's the perfect medical excuse for a sleep-deprived father hallucinating a monster and tragically shooting an innocent boy. But as an analyst, you have to look at the anatomy of the crime scene and the anatomy of the creature. The media claimed the father's tired brain just distorted the image of Toby crawling in the dirt, but the father explicitly noted the entity was wearing a filthy, oversized yellow t-shirt. Toby's mother confirmed he was wearing a yellow t-shirt. The brain didn't hallucinate the clothing. So here is the terrifying reality the police missed. In the wild, predators often use mimicry to lure prey out of their safe zones. Whatever was living under that house didn't want the boy. It wanted the father. Toby was just an innocent kid who crawled into the wrong dark space. The entity trapped him there. It used Toby in his yellow shirt as a visual decoy, and it used the daughter's voice as an audio lure to drag the father out into the dark. And when the father panicked and started firing that shotgun blindly, the entity simply slipped away into the shadows, leaving the poor teenager to take the bullets. But the most chilling part of this entire file, muddy handprints on the inside of a 3rd-floor window in Nevada. Whatever he let out of that crawl space, it didn't stay in Ohio. It packed its bags with him. The handprints are on the inside of the glass. It's not trying to get in. It's already inside. What's your verdict on this one? Was it a tragic accident, fueled by severe insomnia, or the perfect alibi for a parasitic entity? Let me know. Kyle and I had been best friends since our freshman year at Penn State. We were bound by the proximity of our dorms and a shared major we both ended up hating. But by the time we were seniors, the friendship had curdled into something sour, something toxic. Kyle had grown arrogant, reckless, and he harbored a nasty habit of flirting with my girlfriend, Sarah, whenever he had more than 2 beers in his system. It wasn't friendly banter, either. It was calculated. On top of that, he owed me $3,000 for rent he'd blown on offshore sports betting. We honestly despised each other. The air between us was always thick with unspoken resentment. But we had planned a week-long backcountry hiking trip to the Red River Gorge in Kentucky nearly a year in advance. We had dropped a lot of money on non-refundable gear deposits, and out of sheer, stubborn pride, neither of us was willing to be the one to back out and eat the cost. So, we packed his dark blue Subaru Outback and drove 7 hours south in suffocating, miserable silence. We hiked 12 miles deep into the cliffy wilderness, deliberately going far off the marked trailheads. We wanted to rough it. By the time we finally pitched our tent in a small clearing, the sun had slipped behind the towering limestone cliffs. The gorge was instantly plunged into a deep, bruised purple twilight. The isolation out there is absolute. There is zero cell service, no flight paths overhead, no distant hum of an interstate. Just the crushing, physical weight of old-growth timber, damp earth, and creeping shadows. Kyle was acting strange the entire hike in. He was usually loud and obnoxious, but he had been unnervingly quiet for miles. He kept constantly checking over his shoulder, stopping mid-step to stare into the dense, dark rhododendron thickets, acting as if he expected someone to walk right out of the brush. Around 9 p.m., we had a small, smoky fire going. The temperature had dropped, leaving a sharp chill in the humid Kentucky air. I was sitting on a fallen log, whittling a thick pine branch with a heavy, rubber-gripped camping hatchet. The steel blade sinking into the wood with a satisfying thwack was the only sound breaking the silence. Kyle was sitting across from me on a cooler. He cracked open his 4th lukewarm Pabst Blue Ribbon, the aluminum hiss cutting through the quiet. And that's when the simmering tension finally boiled over. I brought up the rent money. I didn't yell. I just asked when he was going to pay me back. He laughed. It was a mean, dismissive, ugly sound. He took a long pull from his beer and told me to relax. So, I pushed harder. I brought up the way he had cornered Sarah in the kitchen at a party the week before, how he had touched her lower back and leaned in too close. Kyle stood up, his face flushed red in the flickering firelight. He threw his half-empty beer can directly into the flames, sending up a violent shower of orange sparks. "You've always been a paranoid, insecure loser, man," he spat, his voice echoing slightly off the surrounding trees. "Sarah's only with you because she pities you. You're a placeholder, dude. Everyone knows it." I gripped the handle of the hatchet. I gripped it so hard my knuckles turned a stark, bony white against my skin. The rubber handle felt warm in my palm. I didn't say a word. I didn't move. I just stared at him through the smoke, feeling a hot, buzzing static building up behind my eyes. Kyle scoffed, shaking his head in disgust. He grabbed his headlamp from the cooler, strapped it to his forehead, and marched off into the dark tree line to relieve himself. I sat by the fire, nursing my anger. My heart was hammering a violent, uneven rhythm against my ribs. I stared at the spot where he had disappeared into the brush. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The woods had gone unnaturally quiet. The wind had died down completely. Even the crickets and the tree frogs had stopped their chorus. It was the kind of heavy, expectant silence that makes your ears ring. "Kyle!" I yelled. My voice echoed off the distant canyon walls, bouncing back at me before fading into nothing. He didn't answer. I stood up, grabbing my heavy maglite flashlight, and walked into the dense brush where he had disappeared. The beam of my light cut through the thick humidity, illuminating twisted roots and damp moss. About 100 yards from the camp, the trees thinned out abruptly near the edge of a steep, rocky ravine. The drop was easily 60 feet straight down onto jagged limestone. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the edge of the precipice. The light hit him. Kyle was standing inches from the drop-off, his back to me. His shoulders were slumped. "Hey, idiot, get away from the edge," I called out, the annoyance masking the sudden knot in my stomach. He didn't turn around. He didn't even flinch at my voice. But as I took a hesitant step closer, the angle of my flashlight beam shifted, catching the space just beyond him. I realized he wasn't alone. Standing directly in front of him, hovering over the empty, black space of the ravine where there was no solid ground, was a figure. It was impossibly tall. It easily cleared 7.5 feet. It was dressed in what looked, at first glance, like a tailored, dark suit. But as the beam washed over it, my brain struggled to process what I was seeing. The fabric wasn't wool or cotton. It was woven tightly from dead, brown leaves, strips of dried birch bark, and coarse, matted animal hair. The figure was leaning down at an extreme, unnatural angle, its face inches from Kyle's. It was whispering to him. Kyle was standing perfectly still, his arms hanging totally limp at his sides. He wasn't fighting. He wasn't running. He let out a soft, rhythmic giggle. It was a childlike, vulnerable, completely broken sound that made my stomach physically heave. The entity slowly raised a hand. Its fingers were over a foot long, pale and jointed like bamboo, ending in blunt, blackened tips. It gently stroked Kyle's hair, exactly like a parent soothing a toddler. Then, the entity turned its head to look directly at me. It had Kyle's face. It wasn't a mask. It was an exact, biological replica of his features, his nose, his jawline, the slight stubble on his chin, but it was stretched tight, as if a thin latex mold of my best friend had been pulled forcefully over a skull that was slightly too large and too wide for it. The eyes didn't blink. They were wide open, and they just reflected my flashlight beam with a dull, matte yellow glare, like the eyes of a deer caught in headlights. I didn't yell. I didn't try to save him. The sheer, impossible wrongness of the scene shattered whatever bravery I had. I dropped the flashlight, turned, and ran. I abandoned the camp. I abandoned the keys to his Subaru. I abandoned my wallet, my phone, everything. I ran blindly through the pitch-black wilderness. I tore my clothes on thick briars, tumbled down steep embankments, and waded through freezing creeks, driven by pure, unfiltered, animal adrenaline. It took me 7 hours to reach a paved logging road. A county sheriff in a cruiser found me wandering on the asphalt at dawn, covered head to toe in mud and my own dried blood from the thorns. I was completely hysterical. They put me in the back of the cruiser, and I babbled to the police about the tall man in the bark suit. I told them something ancient and wrong in the woods had taken Kyle's face. They looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. They launched a massive, multi-agency search and rescue operation. It took them 3 days to locate his body. He was at the very bottom of the ravine. The coroner determined he hadn't died from the impact of the fall. His skull had been completely caved in by a heavy, blunt instrument before he went over the edge. The detective sat me in a freezing, windowless interrogation room in Lexington for 14 hours straight. They didn't ask me about tall men in the woods. They didn't ask about skinwalkers or entities. They asked me about the argument. They asked me about the $3,000. They brought up Sarah, and the jealousy, and the resentment. Then, the lead detective, a tired-looking man with a gray mustache, sighed, reached into a cardboard box, and slid a clear plastic evidence bag across the metal table. Inside the bag was my camping hatchet. The steel blade and the rubber grip were caked in thick, dried blood and matted human hair. "We found this buried deep under the ashes of the fire pit at your campsite," the detective said, his voice completely flat, devoid of any emotion. "Your fingerprints are pressed perfectly into the rubber grip, and only yours. I lost my mind in that room. I screamed until my throat bled. I screamed that the thing must have come back to the camp after I ran. I screamed that if it was powerful enough to mimic his exact face, it was certainly smart enough to pick up a hatchet and bury it to frame me. The only reason I am not currently sitting on Kentucky's death row is a combination of sheer luck and an aggressively expensive defense attorney my parents hired. Because of the freezing rain that hit the gorge on the second day of the search, the coroner couldn't pinpoint the exact time of death, and my lawyer successfully argued to the jury that my fingerprints were on the hatchet simply because I had been whittling wood just minutes before Kyle wandered off and fell. He painted a picture of a tragic accident and a panicked, disoriented survivor. A hung jury, plagued by just enough reasonable doubt, let me walk free. I moved to Oregon. I legally changed my name. I work remotely now, and I don't make close friends. I know what people think when they hear this story. I read the true crime forums. I see what the armchair detectives write about me online. I know the prevailing, universally accepted theory is that I finally, snapped by the fire, buried the hatchet in his skull, dragged his body to the cliff, pushed him off, and invented a ridiculous, supernatural campfire monster to cover my tracks. Sometimes, late at night, when the apartment is quiet and the insomnia sets in, I even catch myself staring at the ceiling, wondering if they're right, wondering if the human brain is capable of fabricating a 7-foot-tall entity just to protect itself from the horrifying reality of what it did in a blind fit of rage. But there is a single detail from the official autopsy report that my lawyer used to create that reasonable doubt. A physical, undeniable detail that I cannot explain, and the prosecution couldn't either. The severe blunt force trauma to Kyle's skull was struck from a drastic, downward angle. The forensic expert testified under oath that whoever swung that hatchet had to be standing at least 1.5 feet taller than Kyle to achieve that specific trajectory into the bone. Kyle was 6'2". I am 5'9". It is physically impossible for me to have struck that blow unless I was standing on a ladder. If I killed him, if Kyle has been dead and buried in the ground for 4 years, why did I receive a voicemail from his disconnected phone number last Tuesday? It was just 30 seconds of dead silence, and then, right before the recording ended, Kyle's voice whispered, "I like the new couch, man. The leather feels nice." I had bought that leather couch for my locked, third-floor apartment just 3 hours before the call. I want you to think about that final detail. In criminal psychology, they call it an amygdala hijack. A man is betrayed by his best friend, mocked and financially drained. Out in the isolated woods, holding a hatchet, the rational brain shuts down. It is the perfect recipe for a crime of passion, followed by a psychotic break to deny the guilt. But as your dispatcher tonight, I have to ask you to look at the math. The physics don't lie. Kyle was 6'2". The narrator was 5'9". The fatal blow came from a steep downward angle. The prosecution couldn't explain it. But if you look back at the narrator's story, he already gave us the answer. He explicitly described the entity as being impossibly tall, easily clearing 7.5 feet. 7.5 feet is exactly 1.5 feet taller than Kyle. The math perfectly matches the monster. But if you accept that the monster is real, you have to accept the horrifying reality of that voicemail. The entity doesn't just kill, it mimics faces, it steals identities. And if it is leaving voicemails about a newly purchased leather couch inside a locked third-floor apartment, it means that thing didn't stay in the Kentucky woods. It learned how to use a phone. It integrated into society, and it is sitting inside his apartment right now. So, what is your final verdict on tonight's dispatch? Did the narrator kill his best friend in a jealous rage, and the physics of the hatchet swing were just a bizarre fluke? Did the entity take his friend's life and then bury the weapon to mock him? Or is the narrator sitting on that leather couch right now, looking at a 7-foot-tall creature wearing his dead best friend's face? Drop your theories in the comments below. I'll be reading the debates, and I'll pin the one that makes the most sense. If you survive tonight's dispatch, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on the bell. And if you're watching this late at night on your TV, grab your phone right now and tell me, which of these 3 stories disturbed you the most? Until next time, check your locks and keep the lights on.